My name is Blain Roberts, and the title of my paper is It Okay to Talk About Slaves, Segregating the Past in Historic Charleston? If you visit Charleston today, and you may already feel like you've been there, you will be surrounded by time travelers. Each year, about 4 million tourists descend upon the city to get a taste of the past. Yet the historical narratives offered on the tours that crisscross historic Charleston vary widely. Some tourists, like those on the right, explore Charleston's history on carriages driven by guides clad in Confederate gray, listening to stories about the romance of the Old South. Other visitors find themselves aboard tours like the Gullah Tours van on the left that recount the often tragic experiences of the city's enslaved and free black populations. The symbolism of this photograph could not be more revealing. Tours such as these literally pass each other all day long, paying one another little mind. Although Charleston's restaurants and accommodations have not been segregated for decades, a different sort of segregation has emerged in the city. Historical tourism in Charleston is highly bifurcated, offering historical narratives that rarely overlap. Today, I want to explore these disparate narratives, or the ways that the white and black historical tourism industries present the past. By juxtaposing them, we can more fully understand what Charlestonians have remembered and forgotten about their past. Just as important, we can begin to probe the reasons why these public memories remain segregated and what is lost to Charlestonians, to tourists, and to the larger historical narrative as a result. The roots of Charleston's segregated approach to historical tourism can be traced to the Jim Crow era. Largely passed over by the industrial transformations of the New South, Charleston was well preserved. In the years after World War I, Charleston elites began to see dollars and cents in the lavish mansions of their port city, arguing that a booming tourist business was the antidote to its economic malaise. They opened historic houses to the public, placed historical markers around the city, and produced guidebooks and historical dramatizations for radio. In the process, these Charlestonians forged a narrative that became, and in many ways still is, the official history of the city. And it was a history that had its share of blind spots. Black Charlestonians, free and slave alike, figured into this narrative only insofar as they justified the benign nature of slavery or revealed an innate simplicity. Tourists were even encouraged to view the city's contemporary black population through this prism. The ubiquitous African-American vegetable, seafood, and flower peddlers were showcased in the 1920s and 30s as authentic primitives, untouched by time. By the middle of the 20th century, this narrative had been standardized in the history manual by which the city tested and continues to test its tour guides. The 1964 edition of the manual, for example, largely overlooked the city's black residents, past or present. 300 pages in length, it devoted only 2 to African American history. The city's flowers, by contrast, merited 12 pages. Although the most recent edition is more inclusive, it contains a separate chapter on black Charlestonians, the bulk of the manual still leaves much to be desired. It rarely mentions African American culture or slavery, and the Civil War and Reconstruction are treated in predictable fashion. The authors dispense with the cause of the Civil War in one sentence, quote, "In 1860, the issue of states' rights came to its ultimate end, secession," end quote. As for Reconstruction, there is a vague reference to political troubles and heavy taxes, but nothing is said of the revolutionary 1868 South Carolina Constitutional Convention held there, nor the decade-long struggle by Charleston's black majority to secure social and political rights. Most tourists who come to Charleston today encounter a historical narrative that owes much to the one that was born in the early 20th century and that lives on in the tour guide manual. On one typical carriage tour, a guide painted a portrait of Annabelle in Charleston by reminding the passengers that this was the Scarlett O'Hara time. As we approached the home of the Civil War blockade runner, she asked us to imagine Rhett Butler. Another guide noted that Gone with the Wind had been filmed in the city. It was not. While a third transformed the fictional Butler into a real-life historical figure, stating unequivocally that he had a habit of patronizing a brothel on East Bay Street. Anecdotes like these offer tourists a familiar iconography. Yet, by invoking Gone with the Wind again and again, Charleston's tour guides reinforce tired myths about life in the antebellum South, bringing to mind stately plantations and loyal, happy slaves. There are, of course, limits. No 21st century guide will argue that slavery was a positive good. The comments and observations some make about the institution, however, veer dangerously close to apology. One carriage driver offered a take on slavery that was as tortured as it was revealing. Passing the home of Nathaniel Russell, a merchant originally from Rhode Island, she began a series of questions that proceeded like this. Which state do you think imported the most slaves in the United States? Answer, Rhode Island. Who owned more slaves, Robert E. Lee or Ulysses S. Grant? Answer, Grant. Who did Lincoln ask to lead the Union Army at the start of the war? Answer, Robert E. Lee. This line of questioning, which evoked the classic defenses of lost cause propaganda, was intended to plant the seeds of doubt about the connection between the Old South and slavery. How could the South be held culpable for slavery when northern states like Rhode Island profited from the slave trade? So let's not get into this, she pleaded. This was just a Southern thing. Those are her words. For many Charleston tour guides, the problem seems to be more than just a reluctance to confront slavery. It is an inability to acknowledge that blacks were a part of the city's past at all. The same carriage guide began our ride with a discussion of the city's early demographics. In the 18th century, she said, the largest minority group in Charleston was the French Huguenots, who comprised about 15% of the city's population. The other 85%, she explained, were English. Left out of this neat statistical summary was the area's large African-American population. For most of the 18th and 19th centuries, in fact, Charleston had a black majority. Tourists today, however, get a very different picture of early Charleston from most guides. When black history does make an appearance on tours, it tends to be broached cautiously. One guide specializing in Civil War walking tours asked the group at the outset of the tour, quote, is it okay to talk about slaves? When pressed, the guide admitted that some tourists exhibit significant anxiety when slavery or race comes up, in which case he simply sticks to other things. Given the green light, he launched into an uncomfortable routine whereby he assumed the role of a slave dealer and asked a member of the group whether he was in the market for a slave. Soon, a veritable bargaining session was underway as the guide described the types and prices of slaves in 1860 Charleston. Now, on one level, this tour reflected a quantum leap forward from the typical carriage tour, where the words slave and slavery are rarely uttered. By contrast, tours on this walking tour visited the old Slave Mart Museum and heard about white Charlestonians' pervasive fear of slave uprisings. Yet at the same time, the slave experience remained largely overlooked. More disturbing was the slave bargain routine. While an experiential approach to history can have its merits, being made to play at slave trading is awkward, to say the least. One of the major exceptions to this omission of African American history on tours of Charleston are sweetgrass basket weavers. Guides of all sorts regularly acknowledge the artistic contribution